Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sacred Synthesis. We do a weekly teaching that is focused on specific topics that you can tune into in our school community, or if you're watching us on YouTube, hello and welcome. Our school community is for people who want to dive deeper into the teachings, deeper into connection with others, and our community is continually growing, and the people that are coming in are just so profoundly beautiful, so profoundly devoted to their self-exploration, their connection with divine, with unity consciousness, and wanting to learn more about working with our beloved sacraments, silmethoxid and 5-MeO-DMT, which are totally optional, not a requirement to come in and to work with. So come on in. If you're on YouTube, you want to visit us, all the links are down below. And if you are in school already, hello, welcome, honored to have you here. And I'm super excited for this conversation with one of our members. His name is David Blood. He is a Ayurvedic physician of 30 years and also an entheogenic practitioner who has aided people for 15 years in the medicine journey space as well as integration. And I was really excited to see David join our community because I am someone who had the curiosity a number of years ago to learn about Ayurveda and study with a focus on women's health and women's well-being, and also, of course, love working with entheogens. It's really helped transform my life in so many ways. So it's really an honor to have you here, David. I cannot wait to hear what you have to share and to learn more about your journey and how you've been supporting others as you supported yourself in your awakening and transformation and where you are now.
Well, it's a joy to be with you today, Cynthia. Thank you.
Well, first and foremost, I would love to just get to know you a little bit, and then we'll kind of dive into the meat of your wisdom and things that really light you up and common questions that people have. So maybe let's start at whatever you consider the genesis of your journey that's led you to where you are now.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks so much. Well, as with everyone, that's a multifaceted question, but I've heard so often mentioned by people who are drawn to this path that even as a very young child, they were able to perceive that there was something bigger going on, and that everyone in the way in which we live in this world seemed a little bit more like a theater presentation than reality. And depending upon the sensitivity of the young person, that can begin to initiate a process of disillusionment. And I've come to consider it a divine disillusionment, becoming slowly disillusioned of the dream, as it were, and having one's heart be inclined toward the search for what's real, as it were. So I experienced that as a kid. My early psychedelic experience was as an enthusiastic member of the Grateful Dead community. And not to age myself too much, this is back in the 70s and the 80s. And in that context, the psychedelics that I was introduced to, LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, and the like, were used in kind of a bacchanalian celebration, as it were. I don't consider it entirely profane, but there was that bacchanalian, that Dionysian sort of approach to it, music, dance. And, I generally see that as a productive introduction. Um, but after I was done with that experience, I began to notice, also as part of that community, that there were a lot of accumulations in my life by way of habits, manners of living, that I wasn't entirely comfortable with, a little bit too much of a hedonistic thing. I think my body was beginning to tell me that I was only 30 years old and I couldn't necessarily go on like this. And so, in a moment where several factors came together in my life and I had an open window to do so, I went through Ayurvedic Panchakarma therapy, traveled around while I was abroad looking for spiritual teachers and kind of going in that whole direction of change. And I was so amazed by how thoroughly a 30-day panchakarma cleared my channels, gave me a reset, allowed me to have a clear enough mind to really consider what I wanted to do at that point with my life, that I decided to study Ayurveda. I thought that this is a lens onto right life that feels good to me. And so I did. I threw myself into it. I ended up getting a degree in Ayurvedic medicine from an Ayurvedic or from a university that taught complementary medicines. It was like a charter of the UN, and I was like one of the first Western students. So it was an interesting journey. Came back to Chicago in 1998 and opened a small practice and began practicing Rasayana Ayurveda, which is basically internal medicine, as it were, teaching the diet, the lifestyle, doing pulse work, and the like. And there was a great interest in it back during that period. It was relatively new to folks. And then I went on to open a Panchakarma clinic with the co-director and do full Panchakarma services. And I had something that troubled me over the course of this time, and it was that I noticed that a bunch of people were interested in Ayurveda. They were interested in having changes occur in their life, but there was a mental, emotional block, almost like what I would perceive as a self-sabotage. In many cases, I would literally have people come and spend $2,500, $3,000 on panchakarma and come back a month later entirely repatterned, reaccumulated, and it broke my heart. I felt like my desire to teach this medicine was hitting a brick wall in many cases. But then, as I began to be somewhat self honest, I began to look at some of the patterns in my own life with which I was unhappy at that time. One was my relatively chronic use of marijuana, you know, which I justified as a sacred herb and obviously from India, referred to in the Rig Veda, blah, 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 blah. But it was all, somewhat of a cover up for the fact that I was armoring myself emotionally in some ways. And also, I'd realized that the general way I'd been living in my life was an armor around looking at some very troublesome aspects of my childhood, etc. So I became interested in this branch of Ayurveda. Ayurveda has several branches of its medicine, and one branch is called Bhuta Vidya, which literally means science of the mind. And as I began to look at it, I realized that it was the one area of Ayurvedic practice that was heavily based in somatic practice, including, and this isn't 100% academically proven, but I'm led to believe the use of what were referred to as the ancient somas in the Atharva Veda, which people have speculated about for years as having been psychedelic medicines. Um, and so as I studied Bhuta I realized that balancing the tendencies or the elements in the neurology were almost a prerequisite to allowing for a somatic connection in any way with the body. And that the lockup in the process that I was noticing, I wanted to begin treating with Bhuta. During this time, it was a very interesting period because many of the molecules had not yet been scheduled, and so I'd been a student of Alexander Shulgin's work for years. and found a very high quality research lab that basically was able to make available to me a number of the medicines that later became scheduled that folks are beginning to work with at this point. And so I used in kind of a ceremonial way psilocybin on several occasions, and there was a lot of content that would come up for me, and it felt to be shadow work and it felt to be productive. But it was excruciating, as it can tend to be, and it didn't by any means enlighten me, as it were. And I began to experiment a little bit with MDMA, a little bit with NNDMT. And then one day, under a very auspicious circumstance, a friend who I had not seen in years literally showed up at my door after having been traveling for quite a bit. And he said, David, I have something very sacred that I'd like to introduce you to. And he said, I'm not going to tell you much about it, but I think that in the nature of our relationship, there is enough trust that I would never suggest to you an experience that I wasn't really assured would be something that you'd be interested in and would benefit from. And so I said yes, and he told me that it was known as the most powerful psychedelic molecule known, basically. At that point, our friend Martin hadn't renamed it the God molecule yet, so we didn't have that. And it was such a breakthrough session for me that it was the total atomization of the ego I into the non-dual, indivisible light of reality. You know, the type of circumstance that when the practitioner comes back, the practitioner is so amazed to be in body that three-quarters of the ecstasy is just being body in body, and having the realization that, wait, I am that and I am also this, you know? And so that for me was a divine gift of grace that I hadn't even been smart enough to be looking for, because my whole relationship with the psychedelics had all been about shadow work, essentially. And I had thought, this is what the psychedelics are for. They're about digging deep. They're about, you know, getting in touch with the traumas, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not wrong about that, but it began to switch the way that I felt that I wanted to deal in my own practice and also with the people that I was working with, insofar as that I began to notice that the content of the journeys is simply only content, okay? And in some cases, it's necessary to talk about it. And certainly in cases where there is deep healing needed, where there are deep traumas that can't even be felt with like MDMA or something of some nature, can't even be cracked with psilocybin. You know, I went through a very intensive period with ayahuasca ceremony and came to appreciate its central value in the whole shadow work realm. So I recognized that that work was necessary, but I also noticed that there was a different way, basically. And I began working with patients probably about 10 years ago or so in this way. And I would use different psychedelics or different medicines with different people depending upon where they're at. So there were people with whom I worked with MDMA, because I felt that that was what they needed, and that's where they were in their kind of process of individuation and working with the shadow. I worked with psilocybin with some people. I recommended that a few of the people I was working with go down to work with the Shipibo tribe in Peru that I had worked with. So I made it specific to the person, but then I also noticed that there were a number of people who had sufficiently dealt with the shadow, and that in working with the 5-MeO-DMT medicine, that it was possible to practice a whole new approach to integration therapy, which had no concentration on the content of any given trip. And fortunately, with 5-MeO-DMT, even at moderate doses, the content is really minimal. You know, at higher doses, it's that connection, it's the light, it's the dissolution of the ego, but it's not the content, throw or the content of the ego throwing up a lot of stuff. I think maybe for early practitioners, there's some defensiveness where some content may be stirred to prevent the medicine from carrying them further because there's that fear factor. But when one becomes familiar with the medicine, it's rare that you hear a lot of content. You do hear a lot about what people realize at following the journey. Um, so what I began to recommend to myself and to others is that whenever we talk about the content, as it were, of any given journey or any given ceremony, um, that we put it in the form of what in Vedantic terms is called a lila. And a lila is not, so a lila is sometimes referred to as a story, like you're telling a story about yourself, maybe how much you've grown or, whatever, um, or what happened to you. But in the devotional yogas of the Vedantic tradition, a lila is a story that you tell about your interaction with the divine on any given occasion, be it an encounter with the medicine or sitting with the guru. And it is telling that story from the perspective of how that experience helped you to understand your own patterning and how that experience, by grace, allowed some of that patterning to be released. Okay? So when I sit with people with whom I'm working following a ceremony, a day or two after, I asked them to bring me a Leela rather than a story about them necessarily. And what they just simply noticed in that encounter with the divine that somehow changed something in them. And then, we have a deeper process around discussing the non-seeking way. And the non-seeking way is to trust that the medicine, when it brings something up, it's simply to be noticed and allowed. It's not to be reacted to. It's not to be thought about. It's not to be figured out. It's not to be gone on and on about in your integration group. It's something to be noticed and allowed. And then through not seeking to change yourself in any way, to allow the medicine, and it's actually our encounter with the source in that sense of alignment, to allow that to have any patternings which are no longer serving your purpose, to have those simply be rendered obsolete and to fall away without having to do anything about it. In fact, quite frequently, I have people come back to me and laugh and say, I had something that has been binding me for a long time fall away, and I didn't even notice it was binding me until it fell away, you know? And so it's the effortless, non-seeking, letting the medicine do its work. And then I use the Ayurvedic medicine as what the Shipibo tribe in the ayahuasca world would call an arcana. And it's a protective container, as we might call it in our practice, to allow the medicine to continue to do its work in your body mind between sessions, and that requires attention to a dieta, as they would call it in the ayahuasca tradition, or a basic non-accumulating clean diet, um, basic somatic practices, pranayamas, yogas, ashtanga, light body work, between, and this just allows the medicine to unfold and to do its work between sessions. And beyond that, there's no heavy duty journaling or thinking about things or processing things. It's just not part of my practice. And I find that I've had tenfold success approaching it from that direction. So that's a little bit of a long explanation, but that's basically what I do. I think you might be muted.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Such a beautiful overview of your journey and how specific your practice has been and the way in which it varies from what many people are doing, which is a lot of effort based processing and integrating. And I can see how Ayurveda is very complementary to working with these beautiful plant medicines, etc. And I do have to backtrack a little bit in the question, my questioning, and that is for those who do not know what Ayurveda is, can you can you describe that?
Yeah. Well, thankfully, I don't have to describe it as often as I used to, but it's the longest continuously practiced system of medicine in the world. It originated in India some 5,000, perhaps a little bit more, years ago as a result of a deeply contemplative process. So its roots are based basically on a bunch of rishi sitting in the Himalaya, putting out the question, what is the nature of this? you know, and then through contemplations, beginning to have revelations about the nature of reality, the energies of the cosmos, how that all gets condensed down into what we perceive as the so-called physical reality, our bodies. But then when it became Ayurveda, the consideration was primarily on how the gunas or the tendencies of the universe play out in the sites and functions of the body mind, and how the energies, the very elements of our world of which we're made, also govern those sites and functions, and how to work with those tendencies in such a way as to be able to lead an equanimitous life. And so, of course, aspects of diet, aspects of life rhythm, aspects of spiritual practice, somatic practice, use of herbs and medicines, um, are all components of that, as were later Ayurvedic branches of actually surgery and psychotherapy. So it's a very elegant system, as it were, based on some fundamental principles. But because it's been continuously practiced for this very long time, even in its modern manifestation, i.e., with the reincorporation of entheogenic medicines, it's constantly evolving. So now I'm practicing in Ayurveda. I wouldn't say the Ayurveda I'm practicing is dissimilar than what might have been practiced in the past, but I certainly feel that there's a revival underway, and especially because Ayurvedic medicine did in fact work with psychotropic plants, and the ancient soma is rumored to be psilocybin most likely, which if you drive around in rural India and see the psilocybin mushrooms growing everywhere you turn your head, that seems, quite likely. So it's a holistic medicine based. The primary diagnostic that I use is pulse diagnosis to check in with what all the sites and functions of the body, how the elements are accumulating in all those areas, what elements might need to be relieved, what elements might need to be rejuvenated, and whatever medicines and or practices might be appropriate to do
Mm,
that. So,
thank you. That's a great, I think, a very, very in depth explanation of something that is so deeply vast, profound, and specific to each individual person.
yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, and you just mentioned the words specific to each person. And for me, also philosophically, that's at the core of this way of healing. And I think it's overlooked in the clinical venue, perhaps, which is that if the five, along with the other medicines, has taught me anything, it's that I feel that this process is one, as Jung would have described it, as a process of individuation, essentially, and that it's not as in some um, older Vedantic and even Buddhist senses to um, disappear yourself or to um, you know uh, uh, or to not consider it a journey, a divine process, a journey. It definitely appears to be that to me. And in my case, I'm quite certain of it. And I can even look back over my life and see how signs and unusual circumstances and things at the times I might have thought of as failures were all this just beautiful path leading me to exactly this. And it's not over, and nor do I feel it will be over when I die. It's an eternal process into which I feel I've been initiated, and it's also a healing process at the same time. It's a physical body mind healing of trauma, of illness. In my practice, I worked with palliative patients who were dying of cancer, or those who were dealing with cancer. So it's a healing thing, but it also is a divine process of individuation. And so there are no dogmas or nothing that anyone can tell you about it. Your experience of it is its own authority. And so there's no therapist who's going to tell you about it. There's no, priest or priestess who's going to tell you about it. It is going to reveal itself to you, and it simply asks you to remain in the room, you know, and that's all that's required. And what a liberating way, especially for so many of us who have suffered under various dogmas or had times of our lives where we felt like, oh, I must do this. This is the right thing, this will fix me or whatever. Just the liberation of, as the Beatles used to say it, lay in the water and float downstream, or in this case, it's floating upstream, as it were. But it literally requires little more than that. you know. So I'm glad you said that. It is so specific to every person. We often will say things like, well, I had a God experience, and no doubt that is the case. But even that, you know, um, its presentation and also its effect on the patternings of any given person is going to be different.
I really appreciate that point, especially when we're referencing 5-MeO DMT. There's a lot of perspectives out there, and I'm curious about your experience with the low dose, low five approach, because we're many times when working with low, we're not having a full disillusionment, right? We're kind of staying in our consciousness and our awareness of the field around us in some degree. So just
Yeah,
love to know how that's been for you and anyone you worked
yeah,
with.
yeah. Well, in my particular case, I've been working with the medicine, as I said, for 25 years. So um, I don't do high dose anymore, um, uh, because when I do, um, I realize that I'm kind of already there, and there might be some seeking involved with it. And that's because it bypasses any accumulation of content I might have and takes me right past that content directly to the non-dual. And because I've been there on so many occasions, I'm aware that I'm that, and I'm aware that I'm already there. However, I'm catching up to being already there as it were. But in the midst of that high dose experience, it's kind of a bypassing of any accumulated content I might have. What I appreciate about working with the low dose is that any content you have is going to come up. You know what I mean? And it might not come up in terms of a vision or some complicated thought or scenario, but it will come up in the breath. It will come up in a slight feeling of uneasiness, um, and uh, one will be more aware at times that one is feeling uncomfortable than of the opportunity of the medicine just to let things fall still, as it were. And I feel that that is really good work because it's not a deep dive into the content, but it is a noticing by the body mind, even on the most subtle level, that there is still content, there is still patterning that's left to be surrendered. um, and I feel that that process is good. I like that Benjamin suggested that if one need more medicine, that one take a little bit more medicine. And what I like about that is sometimes it's just a little bit more medicine to get you over that hump. And there's nothing really to be deeply felt or explored there, but you just need a little more medicine, as it were. Um, but yeah, but I think that in terms of dealing with the content, it's more subtle. It's just an uneasiness in the body, which is a reminder that there's more letting go to be done. And that it's interesting because I used to have someone that I worked with, this really sweet guy, and he was always afraid to take a breakthrough dose. And what I would do with each of the people that I was working with in my practice is we'd start with a guaranteed breakthrough dose. And that would be the first session. And I would explain to them that it's casting your line. Okay, you're having an experience which is kind of like casting your line, and from here on in you don't need to revisit that experience, but there will be a line in your heart and in your mind that that is there and that is reality. And then in follow-up sessions you can work with lighter doses, and the lighter doses will just reveal to you what patternings are no longer serving you and will take them away from you. Up here in the high desert of New Mexico, we have a saying, the desert will take from you whatever you don't need. you know and I say that about the medicine. It will take it from you. You don't have to worry about it. So this one fellow one day walked in, and his face was so blushed, his face was so red, and I greeted him, and I'm like, hey, what's up? What's been happening since our last session? And he said, oh my God. He said, this pattern that I've been carrying for such a long time just became absolutely obsolete. And a day after our last session, I realized that I simply don't have to do it anymore. And he said, I said it out loud. I said, I don't have to do that anymore. You know what I mean? And I said, well, why do you seem so embarrassed to tell me that? And he said, well, it was pornography. And I just fucking gave him a hug. And I'm like, brother, that's huge. You know what I mean? So the medicine works. You got to let it work, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a pretty profound story of how easily things can be released, right? When we kind of get out of our own way and almost
Yeah,
remove the meaning making of everything.
yeah.
Yeah, amazing. Well, David, I would like to just kind of open the floor if there's something else that's on your heart and your mind that you think would be of super value for people to tune into.
Yeah, well, I think I pretty much have outlined my approach to it. I think that there's something truly miraculous going on, and I think that the gathering that you and Benjamin have brought together is evidence of that. Of course, when I got started in 2000, most of these medicines were black market. They were, illegal, and practitioners such as I who wanted to work with them had to do it very much under the radar. You know, I never hung a shingle. My practice was word of mouth, and I had waiting lists of people. But you know, seeing how now we have veterans who so need this medicine, um, people who are using it for the traumatic work that for which we've only had talk therapy and or pharmaceutical, medicines. Um, it strikes me that it's a miracle, and I'd go so far as to confirm what Terence McKenna used to say about it, which at one point I somewhat balked at. And he said, psychedelics, these medicines, are what it is all about, what it is all about, period. And I remember just being shocked when I heard him saying that, and I'm like, "Wow, that is quite a grand assertion." And now I'm beginning to feel that that very well might be true, that these are the divinely given medicines to help us along a path of evolution, in a path of personal awakening, and that we live in a very special time, you know. And I practiced clinically for years, but I'm entirely, and even in my clinical practice, the our sessions were always ceremonial in nature, insofar as that usually we would do some light ashtanga body work and some breathing, very much as you and Benjamin do it. But we were doing it in my office on my couch, that sort of thing. But the more deeply ceremonial um, uh, practice, I've always felt is the best way to go. So I just really support your work, and am happy to be part of your community. And yeah, that's basically all I have to say about it.
Well, thank you so much, David. It's so evident the journey that you've been on has continued to just like open you and open you and open you. And I so value the time that you took today to tune in and share a bit of your experience and all of this profound information. I echo your sense that we are in a very beautiful time right now, and I feel very honored that I get to be a little bit of a light in this path for other people who are opening up and exploring the essence of their beingness, because there's so much to see, so much to explore, so much to experience. And Ayurveda and yoga and medicine work and some of my other practices have really helped me feel more embodied in my humanness and not disassociate from being on earth.
Yeah.
And five has really been one of those medicines that has helped me cut attachments that wanted me to be elsewhere.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're
Yeah.
blessed.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know you said you're kind of in retirement.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
anybody would want to, are you open to that, or
Yeah.
you'd rather
Yeah.
kind of?
Certainly. Certainly. I do a lot of integration work with folks online for local folks who would like to sit with me for sessions. Um, I do that. Like I say, I don't promote it. I trust spirit to kind of just bring folks to me who are attracted to the approach I take. But I do have an email, and it's kind of long to speak here, but maybe we can put it in the notes. It's davidya.ayurved@gmail.com. Davidya, Davidya dot Ayurved, AYURV as in Victor, ED, at gmail.com. And uh, I don't want to put my telephone out at this point, but why don't we have
Sure.
folks email me if they'd be interested, and maybe within the school community, I'll be comfortable putting my telephone out at some point. But yeah, I'd be happy
Sure.
to.
And we'll just, yeah, people I'll just encourage folks to, if you're open to it, just take a little DM. They can find you and
Yeah,
DM you, and then if you feel
sure, that would
real
be
feeling into their and sharing it, I think that's totally perfect.
wonderful. Yeah,
Amazing. Well, thank you again
yeah.
for
Thank you,
being here, and
Cynthia.
I'm really excited to see how we can continue to engage and pollinate and expand other people's awarenesses of many options that are out there for their journeys. Hmm.
You're right.
Well,
Wonderful.
thanks to everyone who's tuned in. So you know how to contact David should this really be something that sparked intrigue for you. You know what the feeling is, the calling is. So that's available to you. And as always, I invite you all to come into the ceremonies that we host each month. There's so many other beautiful teachings, connections that are found within the school calendar. So come on in. If you guys have questions, you can always email us info@thesacredsynthesis.com or send anyone on our team a direct message inside of school. See you all next time, and thanks, David.